All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining us today for the first webcast in our HR Buyer's Guide series. In today's presentation, we'll help simplify the buying process with tips on how to buy, plus best practices to ensure that your tech investments support your business and talent strategy. My name is Brianna Harper, and I'm your webinar host. I'm also your resource for any questions you have about today's topic. I'll be taking questions throughout the presentation, so feel free to chat in whenever something comes to mind. You'll also see a follow-up email from me after the presentation with today's slide deck and a link to the recording. If you have any questions after the presentation, please reach out. You can email me at bharper@outmatch.com or find me on social at OutmatchHCM. As I mentioned, this is the first presentation in our two-part HR Buyer's Guide series. We know with the rise of specialized point solutions, nearly all of which are using AI, that the HR tech market is more complex than ever, and navigating it can easily become a second full-time job. Our goal today is to provide a roadmap so you can invest wisely in new technology without wasting time or spinning your wheels. Then on October 23rd, we invite you to come back for part 2, which is all about proving ROI after you buy. We'll talk about tips for increasing adoption, getting the most bang for your buck with creative use cases, and setting and reaching your ROI goals. Each presentation is valid for 1 professional development credit for the SHRM CP or SHRM SCP. I'll chat in the activity ID at the end of the webinar. As a thank you for attending today, you'll get a free copy of How to Evaluate HR Tech in the Machine Learning Era. This guide was written by our VP of Talent Analytics, who is also the brains behind the predictive science in our tools here at Outmatch. In this guide, you'll find questions to ask to help cut through the marketing hype and ensure that your organization benefits from AI. Look for an email from me with this ebook after the webinar. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Robin Stencil is the Chief Solutions Officer here at Outmatch, but she only recently crossed over into the vendor side of HR tech. Prior to Outmatch, Robin spent nearly 30 years in HR leadership, where she led talent management at companies like WestRock, Delta Airlines, and Macy's. Having been through the HR buying process many times, she has some great stories and lessons learned to share with you today. Warren Irwin is a Regional VP of Sales. Warren is a fantastic salesperson, but most importantly, for the purposes of this webinar, his job involves working with HR buyers on a daily basis. So he's got great insight on what HR buyers are asking and where they tend to get stuck in the process. And that's going to add a lot of value to our conversation today. Robin and Warren, thank you for being on with us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Brianna. In today's webinar, we're going to cover 3 key areas: questions to align tech, talent, and business strategy, questions to ask when vetting tech vendors, and common mistakes and how to avoid them. We'll then save some room for question and answers to address any of these as time allows here at the end. So we can get an idea of why this topic was interesting to you. We thought we would take a quick poll. As we pull up those results here.
Yep, I'll launch the poll right now so you guys can let in your answers.
So when you are planning to make a purchase, is it in the next 6 months, in the next 6 to 12 months, in 12 months or more, or no purchase in mind, just wanted to join for credit?
I see some answers coming in now. We'll give everybody just a couple seconds to reply. All right, thanks everyone. I'll close out the poll now. All right, so it looks like the majority of folks on the call today are planning to make a purchase in the next 12 months, are just joining in to listen to the conversation today.
Great. We'll make sure this is impactful for both those groups. Poll number 2, what's been one of your biggest mistakes in buying HR tech? You didn't have the buy-in you needed, you didn't have the budget, timing was simply off, or you didn't understand the strategic plan of the business? Again, we'll pause for a chance to answer that.
Yep, I just launched that poll now. Still have some answers coming in. All right, I'll go ahead and close it out. Okay, so it looks like most people answered that they didn't understand the strategic plan. And then some others saying that they didn't have budget were the top two answers for the poll.
Typically the responses I get as well. So today will definitely be an insightful conversation. As we kind of go on here, there's so much available. How do you determine what you actually need when you're evaluating the technology? Looking at HR technology market as a whole, as an organization reaches a certain size, they must have technology in place, such as an applicant tracking system, HRIS, and so on. However, there are also many solutions out there that at first may not seem mission critical, but provide functionality to support actionable insight that drives performance. So how do you as buyers determine what you need? The first question we want to ask is, let's assess what are the strategic objectives of the business, or as many of our clients say, the burning platform. So this starts at the highest level, includes, but is not limited to 3 overarching questions. The first one is, what are the business goals? How do your talent goals support the business? And will technology empower me to solve my goals? So Robin, turning it over to you, when evaluating technology in the past, how did you address these 3 areas?
I think it's interesting, if we look back at our poll, people said this is sort of where they failed most often. If you think about these questions, they can really help you start to create a business case. So you really want to start to think about these things in the context of the business. Often what happens is we'll go to leaders and say, I need this because, and we've got a very tactical explanation of that. If we really start to think back about the goals of the business, where's the business headed, how are we making it easier to do business? And that might be doing business, if we think about our employees. And then as we think about that, how is that connected to talent? And then it's certainly about technology. It really starts to set the tone for you. It's also a place, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but it's also a great place for you to start to think about, how do you ask vendors these same questions, and how have they done this for other businesses? So how have they helped businesses achieve their business goals? Where have they helped with talent strategy? Again, gives you more data and more information as you create that business case.
That's really interesting. And I noticed you said, how are we making it easier to do business? When you think back to those past evaluations, how did you prioritize investment between most critical need and a best-in-class solution?
So I think it's really about where are your employees spending their time. So I'll take an example of, if you think about employees could be candidates as well. So if you think about your applicant tracking system, if you're an organization who does a lot of hiring, then you think about that, you want the best solution out there because it really sets the tone. Sort of like when someone comes into your house, right? Do you have your laundry sitting at the front door, or is it put away? What does that experience look and feel like? It's the same thing from technology. Is your technology clean? Is it crisp? Is it easy to use? Is it engaging? Does it reflect the experience that I will have as an employee? The same thing as you think about other employee types of things. So again, if you're thinking about that versus, it's both critical, but it also requires a best-in-class solution. Maybe if you think about, and again, different for different organizations depending on your priority, but maybe something like if you're still doing performance management on an annual basis. I know many of us have gotten rid of it, we're doing it more frequently, but maybe we haven't quite made that leap yet. Then maybe that's something where we only need a system once a year. We want it to be functioning, we want people to be able to get in, use it easily, but it doesn't need to be best in class. It needs to be able to capture the data, give us some insights back, but we don't have to have the best in class solution there.
That's really helpful. You mentioned critical and kind of that urgent need. One of our past conversations, you had kind of shared an idea is starting small while keeping your pulse on long-term goals. Can you give us an example of what that looked like in a previous role?
Sure. I think, as you start to think about rolling things out, it's where might you test some things. It's hard sometimes if you think about when I talked about applicant tracking, that's hard because you probably want one system to do that, but you might have other systems that you're doing. Let's say you want to change your engagement survey. Maybe what you're going to do is take a group of folks and you're going to pulse and look at sort of what that looks like for that smaller group, get their feedback, get their reaction. What was that experience like, rather than just saying we've had this engagement survey vendor and now we're going to change holistically to the next. You can start to test this out in different test markets to get the feedback on there. And then you can start to think about, based on that feedback, how do I roll this out to my organization? Or if I'm doing it, how do I make this change with my organization?
That's helpful. And I know we've talked about these 3 key areas, but how long do you typically spend on this why? The why, what is the burning platform?
I mean, I think that's really that's going to be the main piece of it. And really that's going to be, and I know we're going to talk about this later, but that's really the buy-in piece. Why am I doing this? And you've got to have a really solid, crisp reason. Because if you think about it, the why is probably not going to go just to if you're an HR, your HR colleagues, but you're not going to explain to maybe procurement why you're doing this. You might have to explain to technology. You might have to explain to legal. You might have to explain to executives why you want to make these changes. So if you think about it, you are going to spend a significant amount of time doing it. But you're also creating that story, and maybe over time you're also creating the rollout, part of your rollout communications up front.
So mapping out the why and bringing in those stakeholders from other departments is imperative to success earlier in the process.
That's right.
Awesome. Next, we want to kind of think about how will this technology help us achieve our goals. And so as a buyer, you've got to ask yourself, will this technology help me to automate administration so my team can spend time on more strategic initiatives, other areas of the business? Will it streamline process and reduce the time? Will it create a stronger, more positive experience for our employees, our managers, or our candidates? Robin, this really feels like where you're, as a buyer, determining if the solution will drive results. Can you tell us more about some of the outcomes that you've aimed to achieve through asking these questions and what you're able to accomplish with those reallocated resources?
Yeah, if you think about automation as an example, so if you've got administrative work that you've got your team focused on, and if you start to use technology and you're able to automate that, you can start to ask yourself, now with freed up resources, can I take and can I maybe upskill or reskill those resources to go do other work? I don't know any organization that I've been in or that we've talked to as customers who say, we've got too many people and we just don't know what to do with them. A lot of times it's we're not focused on the right things. So how do I get people focused on things that will make more of an impact? The same thing if we think about sort of streamlining our processes and reducing time. If I'm spending less time in a process, I can have more time to be more strategic. I think as HR, we're being asked to be able to be more insightful. So if I've got automation, I'm probably getting data. I'm now going to have time to look at the data and truly create insights and go back to the business. And then I think if we think about that experience, more and more we hear about this, and it's so important of how do we engage this. And oftentimes our HR systems, our HR technology isn't connected to our business system. So it's something where someone goes out of their daily business system and into this HR system to do their work from an HR perspective, whether that's signing up for my benefits, whether it's managing my performance, whether it's doing my learning. A lot of times we don't have a lot of connections to those things. So we want to make sure that that experience is very engaging for people, and we want them to, we want to make sure that we're driving them to those solutions.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Lastly, as we go on to the next question here, what will be the performance impact? And so we're really looking to measure anticipated success at this point by asking questions such as, with this technology, we're able to drive efficiency. Will the technology provide better data and insights that can be used to improve the performance of the business? And are we better, and by how much, if we have this technology? Or does the cost simply justify the value?
Yeah, so if we think about these things, when you think about technology and efficiency, an example might be around your hiring process. So if you think about it, how might you drive efficiency? Well, if you're really getting to a point, and let's say you're one of the lucky people who your candidate funnel is really large, you're getting a lot of people applying for your jobs, how do you start to streamline that process? Well, that could be through AI. It could maybe be through an assessment tool. It could be through, there's a lot of different technology that can start to help you get your funnel a little more narrow, which will really start to create that efficiency that you need as you think about it. from that, you'll also make sure that, you'll be able to have the data and the metrics to look at that, because now you'll be able to start to measure output. So again, if you think about how much time do your recruiters spend on that top of the funnel, you can start to look and measure how much they might if you start to automate some of those processes. So that might be some of the things that you start to look at.
And this might be a segue into my next question, but one of the things that I typically see is you want to be able to speak to your other stakeholders in metrics they understand or metrics that are important to them. So as a salesperson, we often see and ask for other business functions to sponsor our champion. So in this case, Robin, I'd come to you and say, who on your team should we be working with or getting to know as well to better understand the business? And we're going through that evaluation. So how are you sharing these metrics with other business units to gain their buy-in? And can you give us an example?
Yeah, so in a past life, we were looking at hiring salespeople. And one of the things we wanted to really look at is how do we do a better job? We were changing our selling process. So we really wanted to become more of a solution sale. So how did we do that? We needed to look to understand who did we have today that was doing that well? Based on who was doing that well, what did the profile we're creating so that we could go out and hire that. We decided to enable some technology or to purchase some technology to help us with that. Well, as we were going through and trying to solve this problem, I realized I didn't have any budget for it. Seemed like a great plan. Just talked to a vendor who said, hey, we can help you do that. Matter of fact, it was so interesting. We said, well, let's talk to some other vendors. But like you would ask someone, you asked me, do I have budget? And my answer is no, I don't have budget. So I went to one of our business leaders that I knew was being most impacted by changing our selling and said, here's something I think we can do. Here's what the outcomes would look like. Would you be interested in doing it? And here's the cost. And we could do this as a pilot. Your organization, if it makes sense, will take it out through a broader sales organization. And that's where we're kind of gaining that funding. So again, creating those relationships along the way is really important. To your point, talking in the terms that they're able to and showing how you can make the business more efficient really sort of paid off in that end. We were able to gain and secure funding.
What I'm hearing is if you really have a good understanding of that burning platform and that why, it's going to be easier to articulate to other parts of the business how it's going to impact the organization as a whole.
That's right. Kind of going back to the first slide we were talking about. So I think, let's switch it here. You've been asking me a lot of questions, so I think
I'm
gonna put you in the hot seat now. So in sales, what are the questions you get most from buyers? So I can tell you kind of what I think about asking, but you talk to a lot of different buyers. What are they asking you?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the other end, as a senior salesperson, there are several frequently asked questions that I hear throughout the evaluation process. And some of the most important ones, and depending on who your audience is, one might be, how do the features and the functionality being proposed tie to my business needs? How does the UI support candidate and employee experience? Is it mobile enabled? That's a big one that I see, especially with things that we're looking at around the Amazon effect and rising expectations from both employees as well as candidates. You've got to think about your evolving workforce and the talent that's out there and their expectations around experience. So increasingly, the ability to access tools and solutions via mobile should be a given when you're doing those evaluations. Does the solution support multiple languages? And this is a big one for me. Personally, working with strategic enterprise clients that are global, you've got to think about your growth plans. Even if you operate in one region or language today, what does that future look like? And how will the partner support me long term? So many of our clients will start with domestic pilot engagements, but they'll have this question around how do we phase this and roll this out globally? So what does that look like? You want that salesperson to be prepared to answer that question and kind of map out what the future relationship looks like as well. What does reporting look like? Can I connect to other systems? How will it help me tell stories? So as HR professionals, you want to think about how accessible this insight is and where it will help you and your team to increase your voice at the table. Will you be looped into projects earlier versus the 11th hour? Will you be asked to support strategic initiatives versus being an afterthought in some cases? What is your current roadmap and what was it 6 months ago? What progress are you making? That's a really big one because you hear often, oh, we're doing something, but it's on the roadmap. So vendors will often say, we're working on it, but they won't provide clear clarification around what that looks like. It'll be a really ambiguous date as to when that feature or function will be released. So as a buyer, find out if promised features will make it into production by asking for transparency up front. This is also an opportunity for you all to really develop a true partnership of accountability if moving forward with that relationship. What is your customer retention rate and how long have you had that rate? So not just what is it now, but what has it been over the last few years? Use this as hard data that will demonstrate the real level of support and benefit you'll receive in that relationship. What does integration look like? Is this a box solution or is it something we can create a seamless, streamlined process with? So we talked about earlier, Robin, the idea of automating things and freeing up resources. Is this going to provide a Band-Aid or a solution? And then how are you different from your competitors? This is one that I get very often. You'll be able to tell a lot about a vendor or partner by their understanding of others in the market and their honesty in this answer. So how open and candid in this response is the response that you receive? Robin, tell me about a time when your solution didn't work, that you were actually working on. What are some of the what don't customers ask they should be asking?
Yeah, I think as you think about kind of what don't customers ask that they should be asking, I mean, the big question is really around what have been the failures, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess maybe you've gotten this question before, Warren, but really it's thinking about what hasn't worked well, in the solution. When wasn't the solution successful? So I always like to find out, much like when we think about the interview process of candidates, we might ask them, tell us things about when they were successful. We also ask them to tell us about failures. So I think as we think about that, a question to ask, and I guess a question that, maybe I'm not going to put you on the spot to make you answer it at this point, but one that I would ask you if I were sitting kind of at the table is, tell me about that time when something didn't work. What was not successful about that? And really what I'm trying to gain from there is, look, we all have failures, but what did you learn for it? How did you recover from it? And how are you going to make sure it doesn't happen again? Or if it does, what's the quick fix for that?
Sure. It's like you're putting your cards on the table. So it feels kind of like an interview when you're asking for, what is your strength? What are areas you can improve? I imagine you receive some answers that are fairly honest if you've built that trust.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Moving on to another poll, what are some of the other questions you've asked as an audience? Go ahead and chat those in and we'll share those here in a moment. So we're waiting on those replies. After you've answered questions, what are typically the next steps? And I'll pass it over to Robin, who's been in this position.
Yeah, so I think, once you've kind of gone through there, we talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but it's really gaining buy-in. And so it's really important to understand your organization and what the process is going to be. So whose support are you going to need? Do you just need to are you the one who can sign off and say, hey, I think this is a great solution, I want to do that? Do you need to just get your peer group maybe within HR? Or do you need to get maybe technology involved? Do you have to get IT involved? Do you have legal, procurement, leadership? All those become departments that oftentimes we're seeing, particularly in large organizations, that need to have buy-in in the process. A quick story on this. I was working with an organization and we were growing very quickly. Sometimes as you grow quickly, communication becomes a bit of a change. And we had changed a bit of how the buying process worked. I was used to going out, finding a vendor, maybe talking to a couple of them, and then saying, okay, this is who I want to work with. I'd go to procurement and say, I've picked my vendor, help me kind of go through and finish the process, and maybe we'd wrap it up in legal. And so I went through that process one day, and I called procurement, and they said, nope, that's not how it works anymore. And so we needed to get procurement, said, here's kind of the process that we're going to run through. I realized I needed to get IT involved because now we were having a different relationship. All good and great, but changed, right? So how we get that, how we worked with legal was a little bit different. But what ended up happening was I anticipated having a solution and kind of starting an implementation process in about a week. My week just got pushed out significantly because while this was my burning platform, I hadn't created a burning platform for anyone else.
Sure. So really understanding where this is going to tie into the overarching strategic initiative is going to help you to get that support faster.
That's right. I think the next thing really kind of goes around securing budget. So I shared with you a little bit earlier about a story of not having budget. So I think it's really about understanding what's the budget process, putting things in, but we know things come up along the way. Maybe all of a sudden there's new technology that you didn't realize that was out there and can really solve a problem and you want to take it out. So you have to think about, I guess, a couple of things. In your organization, can you reallocate dollars? So could you decide not to do something else in order to put some technology in that would free up resources and make things a little bit easier? Or back to kind of my earlier story, what are the relationships that you've built? And so is there something that you can do that's, as you think about this technology, is it going to ease the burden of the business in some way? And do you have a champion who would maybe then help fund it? The other thing is maybe if you're in HR, you go to your HR colleagues. So if you think about, I was in the talent organization in my last company, I had a peer who was in technology. Oftentimes we were knocking on each other's doors trying to think about how might we pair our budget dollars together, how might we share those, how might we borrow some of each other's money, but it really became a way of how do we kind of start to create those solutions and how are we going to fund the projects.
So you're really prioritizing business need over available budget in many cases.
That's right. That's right. And then I think the another piece of this is understanding the scope. So if you think about the scope for the technology, are you really buying this for your entire company? Is it for HR? Is it for a division? And then how do you plan to roll this out? So again, all at once or a pilot program? I think we're seeing more and more, and I've heard this from you too, Warren, is that really it's hard to roll something out across an entire enterprise. It's a huge change management effort. So a lot of times what we're seeing is people are buying maybe for a division or a department. They're trying something and then they're rolling it out. They're getting that feedback. Again, we talked a little bit about, I can remember looking at an engagement solutions. We had several vendors that we really liked. We got down to 2. And so what we ended up doing was taking and running pilots in 2 facilities to kind of see what was the feedback, what was the difference, how did we like that, and that really helped us as we started to cultivate that interest. So again, we started small. We knew we were going to go large pretty quickly, but it helped us kind of determine who was the best vendor and to get the feedback from that too.
Yeah, that's definitely a common practice. One of the things that I am proactive when talking to my clients about is making sure they understand this is where we're starting, but this is where we're going, so that when they go back and speak to those stakeholders, this is what the pilot's going to look like. This is what the long-term solution is. So we're on the same page from the very beginning.
Yeah. And then timing, when do you expect to implement this new technology? So what does that look like? Again, back to my story of not really knowing that the process had changed. I got behind the gun a little bit there. So I had set an expectation with my boss at the time of, look, we're going to sign this deal. We'll get the implementation up and going. I think we'll be up and running in about a month. And that didn't happen.
So with tons of evaluations going on, how often are you going back to check with procurement or with your team to see where the process may have changed?
Yeah, it's a good thing. I think I learned early on is that if I started to even just, maybe I went and looked at something, I thought it was interesting, maybe I downloaded a white paper, I would kind of start to say, you know what, this is something that's starting to be intriguing to us. I didn't start to take their time at that point, but these are some things that as I look at the roadmap and where we're headed, here's some things that if we look at for the next 6 to 9 months, we might want to start to implement. Tell me, I know I need to contact you, but has anything else changed?
That's a great takeaway.
And then the process that that you need to go through. So what is it that you'll want to make, through your selection? Are you going to have an RFP, an RFI? How many meetings will you have? How many times, if you're thinking about technology, there's often demos involved. Who is going to be involved in the process? And I think at that point, you're going back to those key stakeholders again, and you're really thinking about who did you need to include? So I'll go back to and say, if you're going to include procurement, are they helping you? A lot of times they're helping set that up. But now if we've got technology or IT involved, have we invited them in to kind of look and understand the solution early on? They may not have the same business need that I have, but they've got a lot of questions on the back end. So where are we including those? Maybe if you've got someone from legal, particularly if you're in HR and you're going to do something that might cause your legal department concern, you may want to include them up front. I kind of think taking a broad approach about inviting, people can always say no thank you, but at least if you're inclusive of the process, you'll kind of get that up front and sort of start to see what your stakeholders are seeing and what concerns they might not have as well.
When you receive that kind no thank you, are you facilitating a separate meeting so that they can check the box, or how does that work?
Yeah, often if someone says no thanks, I don't need to go to the demo, then I might just check back in and say, well, tell me how you want to be included in this process. What's your role? What are things that you need? If this doesn't make sense for you, are you going to want a separate meeting, or there's some takeaways that we can provide you? So really understanding what they need to help put their stamp to the yes as you kind of go through the chain.
Makes a lot of sense. So as you look back, what has been a mistake that you feel that you would have done differently or that you have made when implementing new technology, and what were the consequences of that?
Yeah, so I mentioned kind of this timing being an issue. I've gotten bitten by this probably twice, and then I think, maybe I've learned my lesson now. Yeah, it didn't take 3 times to do that. I always think things will go a little bit faster. So I think it's about really understanding the timeline. not just about the solution and the implementation, but also about your process. And so I talked a bit about being bit by this. So my one time was getting bit on the process and not understanding timing. The second was more on the solution and really what it took to implement. And so as we got through, I probably didn't ask enough questions about how quickly we would get to implementation. This is one of those times when I didn't have budget, so I'd gone and gained business support, and our business leaders were looking for a really quick turnaround from a solution standpoint, and we had to come back and say, it's going to take a little bit longer. We're going to go through, we're going to gather some really great data for you, but in order to do that, we've got to take these steps. And so I told you one thing, I will get you the answer, it's going to take a little bit longer. So one of those things of making sure that you're really clear. I was lucky that I had a very kind sponsor who was okay with it, but again, you never want to disappoint those people, particularly those people who are willing to give you money.
Mm-hmm. And you've talked a lot about the internal stakeholders. How did you communicate that back to the salesperson?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. So look, we all get a little pushy with our salespeople, and you probably have never felt that,
Never
right?
felt it.
Never felt us saying, can we move it faster? How can we do that? But really talking to them, and really, I think to your point, you mentioned the word partner before. So if you picked the right vendor, you picked a partner. And so looking at that process and what were some of the things that we could do a little bit differently to be able to start to see solutions sooner, or start to see the results of the solutions sooner. And they were able to help us get there a little faster. And then we knew we were kind of building upon that. So what we really ended up doing was starting to uncover the data. So rather than gathering and giving a grand aha moment back to the business, we started sharing, and probably a better way to do it, quite frankly, anyway. Here's what we're starting to see from candidates. Here's what we're seeing a little bit more. And here's kind of now what we've seen over a, maybe a 6-month period. And so we were able to really do that. And our salesperson really helped set that up.
So to recap, what I'm hearing from you, Robin, is some of the common mistakes and how to avoid them. We've talked a lot about these indirectly, but here are a few of the things that we want to avoid. Not connecting technology to strategy. Is it not connected to your burning platform or your why? Not gaining the buy-in. Are you looping your stakeholders in quickly enough and often enough? Not understanding the process. So what does consensus buying need to look like? What is budget and so on? And then not really fully vetting a vendor, making sure that they're a strategic long-term partner. Anything else you would add there?
No, I think that's really a strong list of thinking about it. I think I can't probably, that last one to me is really important. It's really easy to bring a vendor on board, but I really think it's important to think about if this is connected to your strategy, if it's critical, are you picking somebody who's really going to be in this for your partnership? Are they as invested in your success? Because in the long term, that helps them. And that will really set the tone for how you can do really, not only achieve those goals, but if you find those people, you can also do some really cool, innovative things as well.
Absolutely. It needs to be a mutual fit on both sides.
That's right.
We'll now turn it over to some of the questions we've been receiving.
As we look at the questions, did you want to maybe jump back to the poll where we asked people to share with us some questions that they asked from a vetting process?
So I haven't gotten any questions in from that earlier poll where we asked you guys to write in any additional questions that you've asked some vendors in the past, or even questions you've asked of your own internal teams when you're trying to get buy-in or budget or alignment. So as you think of those, feel free to chat them in and chat in any other questions you have for Robin and Warren at this point. I have a question. One thing we're trying to do at Outmatch is really bridge the gap that exists between talent acquisition and talent development. And using things like assessments and video interviewing really on the post-hire side and kind of discovering what's possible there. Do either of you have any stories or examples of how talent acquisition and talent development or learning and development have worked together? Robin, you mentioned splitting the budget, and maybe what would that look like if organizations are really trying to use a single tool for two purposes?
Yeah, I think, and look, every organization is organized a little bit differently. I think I have been fortunate enough to sometimes have both talent acquisition and learning and development, not all the time, but sometimes both of those functions. So it makes it a little bit easier of how to do that. But I think it's important to, if you're the champion for that project, how are you bringing in both parties? How are you selling the solution to kind of gain one point of view and one perspective? How are you working with both your internal procurement, but then also how are you working with that group of, vendors or partners that you want to bring in to really start to show how the solution can come in and solve both of those problems? And I know, as we've looked at this in previous organizations, oftentimes it's where do you get the biggest bang, kind of has the loudest voice. But then I think the other party starts to see where can this benefit from them and that connectivity and that importance to it. So for example, if you're going to use, I'll use an experience that I had kind of actually using assessment, where we were using an assessment on the front end and the hiring was really important to us. But what we really saw was some great benefit from the development side of it as well. So really bringing in the development, our development folks to kind of look at it, understand it, and think about how that was going to create that. And then really bringing in our HR generalists as well into that piece of it, because they were going to be the consumers of it. So it's not just how, if you're in a center of expertise, but it's also how do your generalists start to consume it and how are they applying it to both employees and managers?
Yeah, and from my seat, I mean, we're asking a lot of questions internally, but once you've built that trust with your salesperson, ask them, how can you help me to bridge the gap?
That's right.
Very often I'm speaking to one part of the business when in reality, there are other parts of the business I can help. So my goal, Robin, in this case would be to help you directly, but at the same time, I'm going to figure out how do we help you to increase your voice internally, get other stakeholders involved, and what does success look like to them, speaking their language. Doing that early and often is just going to help you that when the time is right, be able to implement as fast as possible.
Great, thank you. I have another question here. You both mentioned doing a pilot program, especially if you're in a large enterprise, because it's difficult to roll something out immediately at scale. Now, what would you suggest for smaller organizations, small businesses, mid-market businesses? Does it make sense to take those steps and scale incrementally, or is it a little bit easier at that size to implement company-wide?
I think, again, depending on, there's probably some sort of threshold. So if we take maybe 2,500 or less employees, you might be able to roll something out kind of to your organization. Probably depends on how you're organized. So again, how do you kind of bring things together? I think about if you're maybe a small restaurant or small retail environment, you maybe are looking at doing it from a store perspective. Do you take a region or something like that? Again, it's going to depend on the technology and what you need. Sometimes you need scale to get data and information to figure out if it's going to be successful. That's been my experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd ask my salesperson about economies of scale. If I'm looking at a smaller scope, what is it going to look like if I were to roll this out for the whole enterprise? And so am I going to be able to justify the value of the relationship much more easily to my internal stakeholders? And then can I take that value and turn it into something that my business will understand? So if I'm working with a retailer, it's going to cost me, 3 pairs of jeans per store per month. That's something that's a lot easier for me to understand versus looking at a dollar amount. The value's there. Again, work with your salesperson, work with your team to make sure that the value is justified.
Yeah, absolutely. I got a chat in from Tom who wanted to share with us one of his questions that he's asked of vendors. So he said, I've asked vendors to name companies they've worked with that are like mine, hundreds of employees, complexity, line of business, geographies, footprint, et cetera. Is there anything that you would add to expand on that?
I think that's a great question. It's interesting. We were having this conversation. I was talking to some others today, and we were talking about it. I think that's great to kind of figure out, how do you understand my industry? Do you understand my business? Back to that partnership piece of it. And then I think, asking it is super important. I also think, though, if someone hasn't done it, is there something that's relatable to it? And does that make sense to you? And can it provide you some innovation if they haven't been in your industry? Maybe they've done an adjacent industry and they actually pushes you to think about something different. So I love asking the question. I think it's perfect. And then I would completely add that. I think it's one we probably missed kind of in our set of things. As you think about that, I think really what you think about is what's the answer. And so if the answer is no, they don't have a lot of experience, are you no longer going to want to work that person, or how are you going to think about it? So I think any of the questions you ask, you have to really think about what's the answer that you're looking for and what are those knockouts that you've got.
Yeah, I definitely think that with being more jobs and candidates available, you've got to think creatively and look at next and best practices. And so understanding what are similar challenges that other organizations have been through, and then making sure that the person you're speaking to can articulate those back to show what the outcome will look like for your business. And so that's a great starting point, maybe taking it just one step further to get a little bit more insight into what's going on in the market would be helpful. Great question.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Robin and Warren, for all of your insight today. That was very helpful. That was all the questions I have, but if anyone on the call thinks of anything else, after the presentation today, please don't hesitate to reach out. I can always get you in contact with Robin and Warren. And even if you're not in a buying cycle with us, we're happy to help you through some of these things. We're always a resource for you. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to let everybody know that we have part 2 of this webinar series next month. So thank you again for attending part 1, which was Talent Meets Tech, how to buy so it supports your strategy. Don't miss part 2 in the series, After You Buy, how to get the most return on your HR tech investments. We'll cover everything that happens after you buy, including tips for successful implementation and how to measure ROI. It's happening on October 23rd, and I hope to see you there. Thanks again, everyone.